outstretched hand, smiling.
Hello, this is Max from Belonging Education, and this is my 7th episode in the What is School Belonging series, where I speak to inspiring people, people I admire, who are either directly involved in schools, who support schools. So today I was thrilled to sit down with Rosetta Lee. I happen to have met Rosetta, worked with Rosetta almost 30 years ago when we worked at an amazing summer program where school belonging was in effect big time. We worked with leaders, and I got to work with people like Rosetta who understood how to make each individual child feel a strong sense of belonging or work towards that. Rosetta's vision and work for helping children feel connected and feel like they had a place to belong has always been strong. It was strong even then, and she's only continued to pour into this work and develop this work over the years. I've been inspired in her work as a educator myself, and I know she continues to do it. So I'm really excited to talk to Rosetta today. Rosetta is a classroom teacher and consultant working with organizations, particularly schools, on diversity, inclusion, equity, and cultural competency. She's a premier national voice on equity, inclusion, and community in schools. Based out of the Seattle Girls School, she spent more than 20 years training educators across the country. She's also a leader in training and supporting affinity groups in schools. You may know Rosetta's work from support within the National Association of Independent Schools, including her leadership at the Diversity Leadership Institute and the People of Color Conference. Rosetta is an expert on building identity-safe spaces and utilizing affinity groups to foster authentic community. So I'm very excited to talk to Rosetta. Hope you learn a lot. Please like, share, comment, email me. I want to keep this conversation going. Okay, enjoy.
Tracing lines I used to hide, found a law.
We had this anti-bias framework. There was putting words and thoughts into action. And I want to ask you, like, what is your definition of sense of belonging in schools or in educational spaces for kids?
So for children experiencing a sense of belonging, I think about like the indicators that are often really hard to measure, but make a huge difference. Like when I think about kids saying things like, there's a trusted adult or many trusted adults that I know if I have a problem or something is going on, I know I can reach out to them and that they will support me. I think about kids who are like, it's not about popularity. It's about that idea of I've made some deep connections and friends that, again, I feel like I support them. They support me. I am known and I am loved, right? I think about the idea of the school helps me be set up for success, right? And helps me get there. And what I contribute matters. I also make the school better because of how I show up and what I contribute. So these are all kinds of things, that idea of like the environment exists and the fact that you are there matters, and that institution is in your life matters, right? And it's not like a transactional thing, right? I think about some organizations and institutions where like families are like, you're going to get X, Y, and Z out of this place. So like grin and bear it, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have these things that are going to set you up, but it feels very transactional. When I think about like alums who are like, this place helped me become who I am and set me on a trajectory to who I was going to become, and I want to make that possible for others. Ultimately, I think about belonging actually being an outcome of so many different things, right? It's like when schools are saying, we want to increase belonging, I'm like, there are pieces that go into that, like how diverse is the environment, how inclusive is the environment, how do you recognize like equity issues and address them, and what do you do to build that sense of community? And the belonging, if you're doing well, will show up. So I find it interesting that belonging has become the buzzword when really it's like like happiness, right? Happiness is actually consistent of many different things. And it's a feeling that you momentarily get here and there. But it's not something you just say, you're happy, we're gonna increase your happiness. It's just like belonging is one of those things where you matter. We care about you. We're not going to be perfect, and when we fall short and you tell us, we're going to work on it.
I want to add, there's so much good stuff. One of them is you named the framework that came out of my research as bam, 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 bam. And in some ways it is the Gloria Latson Billings of this is just good teaching. And in some ways it's so, like you said, amorphous, like longing is to be represented in many different things. If it shows up just one time, it's probably not belonging. There's something I struggle with, which is very common in a lot of the schools I work with, of we're going to help every child feel a strong sense of belonging because they'll have at least one adult that they all go to. And my struggle when I'm working with school leaders is how is our starting line so far back? If that's the place the adults are starting at, and we have such little time with children, how do you support adult learning to get there quicker?
I think about the notion of the really trusted adult that you still visit after you graduate and have that deep relationship with. Like, that's not something that every educator can be, right? Because honestly, there are those like moments of vulnerability and connection, and like that moment of need happen, and how I happen to be there, right? But it's that idea of every day though, right? In my classroom, I'm thinking about what am I doing curricularly, pedagogically, in my assessment practices and in my relationship with students, that I feel that every single student feels like I see them, I hear them, I treat them fairly, and I protect them, right? And that is my, like, the what of teaching is clear because of the content that I'm teaching and the age level that I'm teaching, but the how, I am putting into habit the things that increase the likelihood of that deeper relationship potentially happening. But even if it doesn't, at the baseline, they know I'm in their corner, that I see them, hear them, treat them fairly, and I protect them. Even with the students that don't like me very much as a person, they know that all of those things are true.
And do you narrate it in the way that you just said it? Like, are you open about this is a main objective for you and you're working towards this?
Well, it's an objective that I have in my mind, because one of the things that I think about and I talk to schools about is this idea of saying it doesn't make it true, right? For me, it should be seen in the everyday actions and behaviors and things like that. But I am looking for that idea of I'm checking in with myself. I'm also checking in with students in terms of, I might not ask it in that direct way, but I will ask them things like, do you feel like my grading system is fair, right? Do you feel like you have to work harder than somebody else, and you're not sure why? Like, so I think about like fairness kind of things that I could check in with the students, but I'm not saying this is the 4-point framework that I have for good teaching, and you let me know, right? Because I think about a few things. One, when you say that out loud, it becomes, I think about the way like dialogues, for example, have norms. When you have behavioral guidelines, then folks stop participating in the conversation and they start paying attention to, are you following the rules or are you breaking the rules? And I don't want to say that, right? And have their attention be on something besides their engagement in the classroom, in their own learning, their collaboration with peers, that working toward like growth and excellence, right? I also think about this idea of, I think sometimes when you promise it, you actually set up for wounding. And here's what I mean by that. My school has a very explicit sort of like, anti-bias mission, right? So like our second value statement at Seattle Girls School is it is fundamental to understand issues of difference and oppression. I mean, that's a pretty overt statement.
Mhm.
And I always like to talk to my leaders and my peers, like that's a big statement that many institutions are unwilling to make. And
Mhm.
that means that, like, I think about how as a 53-year-old, right? I've experienced lots of different institutions, and lots of the different institutions say we are a welcoming place. I'm like, that's nice, right?
Mhm.
And with all of my identities, like I give them the benefit of the doubt, but I also walk around with my guard up, right? So when the things that happen in every institution and organization, I'm like, okay, like, you know, I know no place is perfect, right?
Mhm.
But when those distinguishing behaviors or those words actually mean something in terms of habits, behaviors, way things are addressed and things like that, then I'm like, okay, I can start lowering my guard, right?
Mhm.
And I think about young people and you like promise them something and they walk around with their guard down when things happen, even though it may be something that may be happening in 100 other schools, their soft underbelly is exposed and the harm feels especially painful. So this is the other reason why I don't promise this, right?
Mhm.
Because I don't want them to think that I got it all figured out and that I'm perfect, right?
Mhm.
But I will be transparent about things like, you know, I really wanted you to feel like I was going to protect you. And this harmful thing happened and I froze and I didn't say anything. And I'm sorry for that. Right. I fell short of what I want to do for you. And the next time, and here's what I learned and how can we repair the situation. That's the transparency is my working toward it, owning up to falling short of it, things like that.
So you're always working on building the environment where that type of dialogue
Mm-hmm.
happens.
Mm-hmm.
We are imperfect,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no our return on investment here is that we will stay in conversation with one another. We'll
Mm-hmm.
own our shit. We'll
Mm-hmm.
I won't say that with kids, but we'll own our stuff. We'll take responsibility, and we come in with an understanding. Like, well, what's the second domain of
Do you
oppression?
see me? Do you hear me? Will you treat me fairly? Will you protect me?
I love it. Oh my gosh, I love it. One of the questions I often get is this work possible in a standard American neighborhood school? And of course, every school is different, but I think when I think of your work, even going back to the summer program where I met you 30 years ago, Seattle Girls School, the schools I use in my research, a magnet school
Mm-hmm.
in heavily gentrified Brooklyn,
Mm-hmm.
a charter school in the Bronx, but very
Mm-hmm.
specific model. You know, have you supported neighborhood schools where you see them getting close to building this I see you, I'm with you, I've got you
Mm-hmm.
culture and living it out?
Okay, so I'll be realistic about something is as a consultant who gets brought in to do trainings and speaking engagements and things like that, if there's a school that is figured it out, they're not calling me, right? Because they don't need me.
Mhm.
um, but I do think about, I think every school has these pockets, right? Pockets of those beloved teachers that are not like cult of personality beloved, but like this idea of like they made a difference in my life and I am better because I was in their sphere and I want to give back and things like that. And so I often think about how do we actually not see them as unicorns, but rather like I think about somebody told me in the United States when a great educator retires, like some of the great projects that they did, some of the ways of being retires with them, and people talk about missing that person and longing for those like really amazing projects and engagements, right? When a great teacher retires in Japan, a lot of those practices are actually widespread. And you may miss the person, but you don't miss the kind of things they used to do. And so for me, I would love to see us get into a inquiry mode of trying to figure out for those teachers, and we know that those teachers exist in all of our schools, finding out what are some of those things that allow for that, right?
Mhm.
Or inspire that. There's interesting research on observable behaviors of teachers who have high performing African American male students. That's often a demographic that falls through the cracks or are under resourced or under supported. And so the researchers were looking for observable behaviors, right? And it was interesting, the commonality that showed up. I would love to do some action research on those teachers who are those inspiring teachers that every student feels like, if I want to feel safe, I, hang out in that classroom, right?
Mhm.
And start not replicating the person, because honestly, you have like tough and fair and a little bit like gruff kind of teachers to the really loving and warm and soft teachers, but
Mhm.
their observable behaviors are actually
Mhm.
universal.
Yeah, I love that. I think in highly bureaucratic systems, teachers become super siloed. And,
Hmm.
it creates that marketplace of like parents who are like, I need my kid to have
Hmm.
this particular teacher
Hmm.
versus have this experience. I think
Hmm.
you're making me think about that. So um, thinking about sort of sense of belonging and
Hmm.
looking to the margins for kids, and
Hmm.
like what you're talking about, I think could wrap
Hmm.
those kids in, whether it's Black boys in
Hmm.
schools,
Hmm.
um, you know, kids with autism,
Hmm.
gender nonconforming kids,
Hmm.
adopted and looked after kids, like our
Hmm.
kids who just, even if we talk about them, we're probably not really talking with them or planning for them.
Hmm.
Will you talk about your affinity group work and how you've seen that
Hmm.
with the overall school experience?
Yeah, so for those who aren't familiar with the concept of affinity groups, it's a gathering, a bringing together of people who have an identifier or experience in common. They speak about their experience from the I perspective. Um, and then many schools will also have things like alliance groups, right? GSA is a common sort of alliance group where LGBTQIA folks and people who don't identify that way, but stand in solidarity with that group, come together to find out how to make the overall institution more welcoming, inclusive for people of that particular identity group. And then there's like interest groups. Many schools will have like culture clubs, right? So it's not necessarily open or closed. The membership is fluid and changing, but it's this idea of I want to share, I want to learn, I want to connect. And I think about for a lot of students who have historically marginalized experiences, and I think about those students particularly who don't necessarily have the support or the personality orientation to do something about it when something goes wrong. I think about like my experience as a first generation immigrant kid. I know I was having like racialized experiences. I was one of the few working class poor kids in my school. Like I know I was having like socioeconomic experiences. There were all kinds of things happening. I was an English language learner, you name it, right? But I feel like the message at home, and I know they meant the best. My parents also being first generation immigrant was just like, don't complain, don't make waves, just keep your head down and work hard. You'll earn your keep, right, by doing well. So for me, I didn't really say anything or do anything about it until I woke up to this idea of, well, this is a relationship. And so if I'm doing all of the shifting and all the conforming and fitting in, then I could be just anybody else, right? So for me, I think the idea of like being identity conscious and identity positive in schools became a real priority for me, to let those kids know you can speak up. And if you're having a disparate experience, that matters to me. And I want to be able to do something about it. And again, if that's not happening on a regular basis, sometimes it's nice to be able to get together with folks who have shared experiences or identities. And I think about My school has lots of different affinity groups, alliance groups, and interest groups. And I think about, for example, the Asian American students. One day we were talking about the model minority myth and where did that come from and how does that impact you? And one of the students said, I feel like sometimes in math classes, the expectations of me are higher than for other people. And the number of head nods that happen, I'm like, we're going to stop whatever we're going to do and we're going to dig into this. Like, what does that look like? How does that show up? When I talk to my colleagues, like, this is not you're doing this on purpose, but this is a common experience that the students are having. I don't know too many middle schoolers who has that like experience and then goes to the teacher and says something, right? And in the meantime, here's this thing that's reducing that sense of belonging and ownership that is there. And so affinity group helps elucidate that, and then we can do something about it. So I often think about how many schools talk about, like, we have a senior speech, right? And then at the senior speech, we discover all of these things that have been happening for 4 years. And if we only knew, I'm like, what are the mechanisms in place to find out? Right? Because if you don't have mechanisms, that's when you're going to find out.
Yeah. I think too of even with the example you gave, I'm expected to be excellent at math because of the skin that I walk in or the history of racism and stereotypes in our country. Children are sitting there doing 2, 3, 4 times the mental work then. So I'm trying to be the best at math. I'm trying to walk in my teacher's brain and fulfill something. I'm trying to understand what my peers who don't look like me are doing, coming into the affinity group, just being able to walk in and not have to do that extra mental load of always double, triple, quadruple consciousness in the school.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful thing. I know you support a lot of schools with it, and I think it's such an important model. And I love how you set it up, affinity, interest, and alliance groups, because I think that is often a criticism that I've received when I try to do them from the outside community. I'm like, well, where does my kid fit in? They want to feel some special space too. It's like, well, you got options.
Yeah, well, and I also think about affinity groups should be just one of many sub communities that your child can belong to, right? So I think about how we have sports teams, we have clubs, we have cast of school plays, we have grade levels, we have advisory groups. All of those are sub communities that if you're intentional about building community, everybody should feel multiple spaces where feel like I have something in common with these folks. I know members of this like community deeper than I do others, and I am known deeper by this group than others, etc. And so I think about the idea of hopefully there are lots of communities, but then when we're talking about folks who have particular types of experiences, there's nothing more painful than a student saying something that is like identity salient that's going on for them, and somebody who doesn't have that experience says, I don't think that's really what happened. Or are you sure that's what happened? Or maybe you're being too sensitive about it. It just shuts that conversation down. Whereas in affinity group, there's like more likelihood for somebody to be like, I'm sorry that's happening. I relate to that. And you're not making stuff up. You know, I always like to say with like affinity groups, and especially folks who don't have historically marginalized groups, like wanting affinity spaces for themselves, like, yeah, I could have an able-bodied affinity group, right? What are we going to talk about? I don't need accommodations. I don't need ramps, and I don't need Braille, and I don't need like closed captioning. Like, what is that?
But there is the what is it? It's like that. Not that I want to talk about her. I think you actually showed. I think this dates us, but I think it's the Ellen episode of. If it was the upside down, like what if people were actually forced to recognize all of the stuff they didn't need to access the same thing? So I got into this museum with no obstacles in my way. And, you know, and then if, you know, someone in my skin is being really honest, and still I complained 3 times on the way. I pulled out all of my Karen cards on the way. there because I wasn't fully comfortable with whatever. So, imagine a world where people with privilege did have to narrate exactly where they were, given red carpet treatment on stuff. Like, what a different world we'd have. So last question, because I know our time is short. Schools who are going into the school year say, our theme of the year is every child belongs. Everyone is welcome. You belong. What is the gift or the advice you would give to schools that truly seem to be invested in that type of work?
Yeah, I always like to ask schools, how do you know? Right. And so for me, like, I think about, again, finding out where the strengths are and then replicating that and amplifying that as much as possible, finding out where the gaps are and doing targeted and focused work, right? And data helps because sometimes we take like generalized data, right? So I was working with a college where they're like 97% of our students like either agree with the statement or strongly agree with the statement that I belong, right? I'm like, have you disaggregated the 3% who don't feel like they belong? Do you know who they are? Because if they're all queer students or all, students of color or all students, that's actually gives you some idea. Like you can say, yay, only 3%. I'm like, if that 3% is all the same group, then that tells me that you have work to do. And I also think about the fact that like everybody has different zones. I'm like, find your zone of proximal development, right? Educational theory says you don't want to teach kids things that they already know because they'll get bored, and you don't want to teach them so much that they get overwhelmed, right? Because they won't learn anything. They're in that panic zone. So the zone of proximal development where there's productive struggle and there's like steps that you take to expand your thinking and learning and growing. I think that's the same way with belonging, right? Like sometimes I think schools rely too much on what they do well already and instinctually. Sometimes schools are like, we're a Quaker school, so these values are embedded in what we do, right? Sometimes they're like, we have such loving adults who really care about the children, right? And sometimes schools are like, we were the first school to be racially integrated in the area. And I'm like, that's great. And that was 150 years ago. Like, I'm just curious, like what has been happening since then, right? And then I think sometimes schools like try to do too much too fast, right? They try to do everything all at once, and then the community gets spent. And there's also like a lot of pushback, like what's happening? Why are we doing so many things? Like, I don't understand the reasoning. I don't understand the trajectory. It feels like you're trying to flip a switch when really this needs to be an on-ramp. So I'm often like, don't measure your success in terms of, are we there yet? Measure your success in terms of, are we moving, right? And if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you need to go.
So step back, really be honest about where you're at using, and I like how you're saying data doesn't have to be a dirty word. It's what we do with that data and which part of the data we're looking at too. Yeah, well, thank you. If people want to reach you, I'll put your email address, all your resources, and reach out to you at Seattle Girls School. Thank you for all you're doing.
Outstretched hand, smiling eyes, comfort humming through the halls, tracing lines I used to hide, found a lost